Claire Matthews believed love would save her, while Daniel Hayes knew it would destroy her. Two lives bound by promises that began as hope, but ended as a death sentence. Claire Matthews had always been the kind of person people admired from a distance. She was steady, reliable, and endlessly patient, especially with her students. At 32, she had built a life that seemed calm and purposeful. To those who knew her, she was a woman with quiet strength, someone who gave more than she ever asked for in return. What most didn't realize was how much of herself she had invested in her relationship with Daniel Hayes, a man who appeared to embody everything she wanted in a partner. He was charming, confident, and had a smile that drew people in. To Claire, he represented safety and possibility. When he promised her a future together, she believed him without hesitation, because she had no reason not to. The two of them seemed like a perfect match in the eyes of their neighbors. They were often seen together at the farmers' market on weekends or walking down the main street, hand in hand. Claire would talk about plans for the house they wanted to buy, and Daniel would nod, adding details that made the dream sound even more real. Friends often teased them about being inseparable, and Claire would smile, never realizing that what looked like devotion from Daniel was something far more complicated. He knew the power of promises, and he used them with precision, always giving her just enough hope to keep her committed. Claire's parents had reservations about him, though they never voiced them too strongly. Something about Daniel seemed too polished, too rehearsed, as though every gesture and word had been practiced. But Claire dismissed these doubts, believing that her parents were only being overprotective. She trusted her own judgment. More importantly, she trusted Daniel. He had promised her stability, a future filled with laughter, children, and a home they would build together. Those words carried weight in Claire's heart, and she clung to them like a lifeline. Behind closed doors, however, Daniel was not the man he pretended to be. He was burdened with debts that grew heavier each month, debts owed to people who had no patience for excuses. His business as a contractor was failing, his clients shrinking by the week, and the pressure of maintaining his charming facade weighed on him constantly. Yet he never let Claire see the cracks. He presented himself as ambitious and hardworking, insisting that their shared dreams were just around the corner. In truth, he was desperately searching for a way to keep his carefully built image intact. Claire had no idea how much Daniel depended on her faith in him. Every time she spoke about their future, about the house they would own or the trips they would take, he nodded and let her believe, even though he knew those promises were fragile illusions. He had no plan to make them real. For him, her trust was a shield against the chaos of his life. For her, his promises were a beacon, something to guide her through the uncertainties of adulthood. It was a dangerous imbalance, but Claire was too hopeful, too invested, to notice. As weeks turned into months, the relationship deepened. Claire told friends she had never been so certain about anyone before. She believed she had found someone who would never betray her. Daniel's voice, calm and persuasive, drowned out every doubt that might have flickered in her mind. To her, he was a man of his word. To him, she was an answer to his problems. The tragedy of it all was that Claire never stopped believing, even when small inconsistencies appeared, even when Daniel's stories about work didn't quite align. She convinced herself that love meant patience, and patience meant trust. She had no reason to prepare for betrayal. In her eyes, promises were sacred. In Daniel's, promises were tools, useful, effective, and disposable. Neither of them could have known that those very promises, spoken in the quiet comfort of late nights and shared dreams, would one day become the chain that sealed Claire's fate. Daniel Hayes had perfected the art of hiding his flaws. To those who looked at him from the outside, he was ambitious and hardworking, a man who seemed to know where he was headed. But beneath the polished image was a storm he could not control. His business had started failing years earlier, small contracts drying up, payments delayed, bills piling on top of one another until the numbers no longer made sense. Each month brought new phone calls, new threats, and new desperation. He owed money to people who would not be ignored, and every day, he lived with the fear of being exposed as a fraud. What kept him going was not hope, but Claire's unwavering faith in him. She was steady when everything else was collapsing, and Daniel quickly realized that her trust could be turned into something he could use. When Claire spoke of their future, her words carried genuine excitement. She talked about saving for a house, of creating a home filled with light and warmth. She dreamed of quiet mornings together, of holidays spent surrounded by family. She even began putting away part of her salary, eager to help make their shared plans a reality. For Daniel, those savings were not a symbol of love, but a way out of his crushing problems. He told himself it was temporary, that he would repay her once things turned around. But deep down, he knew the spiral was too deep. Her devotion became his lifeline, and slowly, he began to blur the line between love and survival. Claire never questioned the withdrawals he made, at least not at first. He told her the money was for deposits on their future home, for small investments that would give them more stability. He wrapped his lies in the language of commitment, promising her that every dollar spent was another step toward the life they had always talked about. And because she loved him, because she believed in promises, she accepted it. She did not see the fear in his eyes when his phone rang at odd hours, or the way his hands shook after meetings he never explained. She believed his version of events, because trusting him felt easier than imagining betrayal. But as the months passed, the cracks began to show. Claire noticed that despite the money she had given him, nothing seemed to change. There was no progress on the house, no paperwork, no sign of the future he painted so vividly. She grew restless, asking quiet questions he always managed to answer with practiced ease. He spoke with such confidence that she convinced herself she was overthinking. Yet somewhere in the back of her mind, a seed of doubt began to grow. It wasn't enough to stop her, but it lingered, a whisper she couldn't silence completely. Daniel, meanwhile, felt the walls closing in. The debts weren't disappearing, and his excuses were running thin. Every time he looked at Claire, he felt a mixture of guilt and resentment. She represented both his salvation and his weakness. Her savings had bought him time, but time was running out. The men he owed were losing patience, and he knew they would not wait forever. The thought of losing everything, the business, his reputation, his freedom haunted him, and with each passing day, the idea of keeping Claire close became less about love and more about necessity. In his mind, promises became weapons. He dangled them in front of her like bait, crafting visions of a future he had no intention of building. She would never have guessed that the man she trusted so deeply was calculating how much longer he could use her before the truth caught up to him. Daniel had stopped seeing her as a partner. She was a resource, one he needed to control, one he could not afford to lose. The dangerous part was how naturally he played the role. To Claire, his smiles were real, his reassurances comforting. She had no way of knowing that behind those gestures, a darker plan was slowly forming. She believed she was walking toward a future filled with joy. He knew he was walking her toward a place where promises would become her undoing, The night Claire Matthews disappeared began like any other. She had stayed late at school, carefully grading assignments and preparing lessons for the following week. The hallways were quiet, the classrooms dark, and her car was the last one left in the parking lot. When she finally locked the doors behind her, there was no sense of foreboding, no warning of what awaited her. To the people who knew her routine, it was ordinary. But ordinary nights can be the most dangerous, because they mask the shift from safety to tragedy without giving anyone a chance to notice. The following morning, Claire's absence was small but unusual. She didn't show up at school, and her colleagues assumed she had fallen ill. When she didn't answer calls, they brushed it off as exhaustion. It wasn't until a second day passed without any sign of her that concern began to spread. Parents wondered why homework hadn't been posted. Neighbors noticed her mailbox filling with letters, and friends grew uneasy with her silence. Soon, the community's calm rhythm fractured, replaced with anxious whispers about where Claire might be. Her car was discovered parked neatly in front of her house, as though she had returned home and simply vanished inside. The vehicle showed no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no scratches that suggested a struggle. It looked untouched, as if waiting for her to slide back behind the wheel. Inside the house, nothing appeared out of place either. Her keys, purse, and phone were missing, but the rest of her belongings were undisturbed. To investigators, the absence of chaos was more chilling than evidence of violence. It suggested careful planning, a disappearance engineered with precision. Search parties began almost immediately. Volunteers walked the wooded trails surrounding the town, their flashlights slicing through the dark as they called her name. Flyers bearing her photograph were taped to telephone poles, bus stops, and storefront windows. News outlets picked up the story, reporting on the beloved teacher who had gone missing without a trace. The more people searched, the heavier the dread became. Every day without answers made the possibility of finding her safe grow smaller. Daniel Hayes inserted himself into the search, appearing at community meetings and offering tearful appeals for information. To some, his composure seemed admirable, the mark of a man determined to find the woman he loved. But to others, there was something unsettling about the way he carried himself. He did not stumble through his words or falter with grief. His voice was steady, his answers rehearsed, as though he had prepared for this moment. Detectives noticed the same. They listened carefully to his timeline of events, and though he recited it clearly, details shifted each time he told the story. One evening, he said he had last spoken to Claire on the phone. The next day, he claimed it had been in person. Small inconsistencies began to accumulate, raising silent questions that would not go away. Suspicion grew as investigators dug deeper into Daniel's life. Financial records painted a picture that clashed sharply with the one he presented to the world. Large withdrawals from Claire's savings were discovered, traced directly to his accounts. To family and friends, the revelation was shocking. To police, it was a crucial lead. If Daniel had drained her finances, then his motives for harming her were clear. Money and desperation formed a dangerous partnership, one strong enough to lead to murder. The town that had once admired Daniel now watched him closely, whispering about his possible involvement. While search teams combed rivers and fields, detectives followed a paper trail that led them closer to the truth. Every receipt, every bank transfer, every lie he had told added weight to the growing suspicion. Claire had trusted his promises, and now, those promises hung heavy in the air. Poisoned by betrayal. As days turned into weeks, hope thinned. The search no longer felt like a mission to bring Claire home alive, but rather a grim effort to uncover what had been hidden. With each passing night, the possibility that she had been silenced grew stronger. Investigators were certain that Daniel knew more than he admitted. His mask of calm was slipping, and behind it, they sensed the shadow of a man who had crossed a line he could never return from. The discovery came not with triumph, but with the sickening weight that pressed down on everyone involved. Investigators had followed weeks of leads that seemed to loop back into dead ends, but one piece of evidence finally broke through the fog. Tire tracks, barely visible at first, were found near a remote construction site that Daniel Hayes had managed only months earlier. The ground had been disturbed, a patch of earth covered with freshly poured cement that didn't quite match the rest. It was too new, too clean, too deliberate. Detectives knew immediately that this was not routine work. With heavy machinery brought in, they began to dig. Each layer of concrete and soil peeled away until the horror revealed itself. Beneath the hard surface lay the body of Claire Matthews. Her disappearance was no longer a mystery, no longer a question with room for hope. It was an answer no one wanted, but one that left no doubt. She had been buried like a secret, hidden under the very material Daniel had built his career upon. The irony struck investigators. Cement, once a symbol of strength and permanence, had become the cover for betrayal and death. What lay below was not an accident, not an impulsive act, but something carefully staged, calculated, and executed with chilling intent. The forensic evidence told a story clearer than words. There were no signs of a struggle in her home or her car, no random encounter gone wrong. Everything pointed to a man she trusted, someone who had access to her, someone who knew how to make her disappear without leaving behind chaos. Daniel's fingerprints were not just metaphorical, they were found on the equipment used at the site. His records showed he had been there at the exact time investigators believed she vanished. His alibi unraveled like thread pulled from a weak seam. The closer they looked, the less convincing his carefully rehearsed answers became. For the town, the discovery shattered the thin layer of denial that had lingered during the weeks of searching. Many had clung to the hope that Claire might walk back into her classroom or call her parents from some faraway place. That hope was gone. Instead, they were left with the image of her body sealed beneath concrete, a victim of misplaced trust. The shock rippled through the community, turning admiration for Daniel into collective outrage. Neighbors who once waved at him on the street now crossed to the other side, their eyes filled with contempt. Detectives pieced together the final puzzle of motive. Claire's savings account had been drained almost entirely before she vanished. Every transfer linked directly to Daniel, who had used the money to cover debts and silence collectors. When Claire began asking more questions about their future, his options narrowed. To Daniel, the truth becoming public meant the collapse of everything he had built: his reputation, his business, his carefully maintained image. He decided that silencing her was the only way to protect himself. It was not a crime of passion but one of calculation, a decision made with cold logic that reduced her from partner to obstacle. The weight of the evidence left no room for doubt. Witnesses recalled seeing Daniel's truck near the site. Bank records aligned with the timeline, and forensic testing tied his presence to the burial. The story was no longer speculation. It was fact written in stone, fact sealed in cement. For prosecutors, it became a straightforward case. For those who loved Claire, it was a nightmare realized. In the days that followed, the construction site became a place of mourning. Flowers and photographs appeared at the edge of the lot, reminders of a woman whose life had been stolen by the very person she trusted most. The promises Daniel had Whispered promises of a home, of a family, of a life together were revealed for what they had always been. Lies crafted to bind her closer while he planned her destruction. When the arrest finally came, it was swift and decisive. Daniel Hayes was led away in handcuffs, his mask of charm stripped from him. He did not resist, did not plead his innocence with the same fervor he had shown before. Perhaps he knew the evidence was unshakable, or perhaps he had simply run out of lies to tell. For the town, his capture brought relief, but no real comfort. Claire was gone, and nothing could undo the betrayal that had turned love into a weapon. The trial of Daniel Hayes began under the weight of grief and anticipation. The courthouse was crowded each day with people who had once admired him, people who had trusted his smile and his charm. Now, they came to see him judged for the crime that had torn their community apart. Reporters filled the benches, their cameras waiting outside to capture every development. The quiet town had become a stage for tragedy, and every detail of the case was laid bare for the world to hear. The prosecution painted a picture of betrayal as sharp as a knife. They presented financial records showing how Daniel had drained Claire Matthews's savings account in the weeks before her disappearance. They showed the jury bank transfers, receipts, and emails, each one another nail in the coffin of his defense. Forensic experts described the scene at the construction site, explaining how her body had been concealed under layers of concrete, and how Daniel's fingerprints tied him to the burial. They argued that this was not an impulsive act, not the result of anger, but a deliberate plan to eliminate the one person who could expose his lies. The defense tried to shift the story, suggesting that Daniel was overwhelmed by pressure and acted without intent, that his debts and crumbling business had driven him into desperation. They spoke of him as a man who had lost control rather than a cold-blooded murderer, but the evidence weighed too heavily against him. The jury listened to the steady timeline the prosecutors had built, each fact stacking onto the next until the picture was impossible to deny. Claire had been deceived, used, and ultimately silenced by the very man who promised her a life of safety. As the trial unfolded, Claire's family sat silently, their grief carved into their faces. Her parents held hands tightly as witnesses, described how their daughter had trusted Daniel without hesitation, believing in the future he promised. Friends testified about the excitement she had felt when talking about their plans, her hope that she had finally found lasting love. Each word deepened the sense of loss, each memory a reminder of what had been stolen. For the jury, it was not just evidence they weighed, but the human cost behind it. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom held its breath. Guilty on all counts, Daniel Hayes was sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole. The decision was swift, but the silence that followed lingered long after the judge's gavel struck. There was no celebration, only a heavy acknowledgement that justice, while necessary, could never bring Claire back. The town changed after that. Trust no longer came easily, and the memory of what had happened lingered in every corner. People who once spoke casually about promises began to view them with caution, remembering how words had been used to manipulate and destroy. The betrayal had scarred them collectively, teaching them that appearances could mask rot, that even the people closest to you could harbor secrets that turned deadly. For Claire's family, closure was an impossible word. They had justice, but not peace. They carried her absence into every day, into every holiday and gathering that she would never attend. Her classroom remained empty, a symbol of potential cut short. The students who had adored her grew up remembering the teacher who vanished and the truth that eventually emerged. She became not just a victim, but a cautionary tale, Her story whispered by those who struggled to make sense of how love could transform into violence. Daniel, now confined behind bars, faded into obscurity. His name, once spoken with admiration, became synonymous with betrayal. The man who had built his image on charm and promises was left only with the reality of his actions, stripped of the mask he had worn so easily. His prison sentence was not just punishment, but the stark contrast between the life he pretended to live and the one he had truly created. In the end, the story of Claire Matthews was not only about a murder, it was about the fragile line between trust and deception, about how words meant to comfort could become weapons in the wrong hands. Her death left a permanent shadow over the town, a reminder carved deep into its memory. Promises, once symbols of hope, were no longer taken at face value. For those who remembered her, the lesson was clear: even the most beautiful words can carry the sharpest edges, and when spoken by the wrong person, they can become a death sentence.